What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're looking at a truly insane game played between Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, and Daniel Naroditsky on January 15th, 2025. And this game features a rook lift right out of the opening that will blow your socks off. What is Magnus doing with this rook lift? I have no idea. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Magnus opens 1e4 best by test, and Daniel does go 1e5. Then we have knight f3, knight c6, and here, of course, the main moves for white are bishop c4 and bishop b5. But instead, in this game, he goes for the move d4, the Scotch opening, a move that is almost all but forgotten at the highest level. And the reason for that is black can equalize very quickly, very easily, if he knows what he is doing. Now here, black continues, e takes d4, then knight takes d4, and now the two main moves here for black are knight f6, that is the main line, and the alternative bishop c5 as chosen in the game. So bishop c5 on the board, pressuring that weak knight on d4. And now where is the knight going to go? Of course, white must defend it. And your three main options here are knight b3, retreating, bishop b3, supporting the knight, and finally the move knight takes c6, trading off those pairs of knights. Now here, knight b3 was chosen in the game, retreating the knight and pressuring that weak bishop on c5. Now where is the bishop going to go? In the game, bishop b6 was chosen, simply retreating. Now here, Magnus gains some space on the queen side, sort of in the spirit of the Caro-Kann opening. He goes a4, and it's sort of like a reverse Caro-Kann. There is that one line with the bishop all the way over on the f5 square, g6 square, wherever it is, where you go h4, h6, h5, bishop h7, and so on. You know the one I'm talking about. Instead, in the game, a4 chosen, chasing the bishop on the queen side. Now we have the move a6, giving the bishop a retreat square on a7. Of course, the threat here was a5, trying to trap that bishop. Therefore, a6 or a5 here immediately is forced. Now in the game, a6 chosen, giving the bishop some loft on the a7 square to retreat to. And by the way, I keep getting this guy in my email saying loft is not the right word. It's Luft or something, some German word. I'm going to keep saying loft, giving the bishop some loft on the a7 square. Now here, white goes knight c3, developing the knight, threatening potentially knight d5 ideas later in the game. That could be one serious threat. And now here, it's still in the opening, but already it is absolutely critical for Daniel Naroditsky to find the right way to proceed to make sure he doesn't come under a tremendous amount of pressure. Now here, the computer says the two main moves for black are just to continue with the moves knight f6 or d6, very logical developing moves. However, instead, Daniel, he plays a move that is very typical for the bishop c5 line of the Scotch opening. He goes queen to f6. Now, the idea behind this move, you are threatening checkmate literally in one move with the move queen takes f2. So that would be absolutely deadly. Of course, white is going to have to respond to that, and the two easiest ways to defend are queen to e2 and queen to f3. Now, in the game, queen to e2 was chosen, defending f2, and very importantly, keeping those queens on the board. Of course, queen to f3 would give Daniel an opportunity to trade queens, so Magnus here showing he has some very aggressive intentions for this game, trying to keep the queens alive and placing his queen opposite the black king on e8. Now, the drawback of this move, queen to e2, of course, is that bishop on the f1 square is now trapped on the f1 square. It can't develop anywhere, and that means white may need to resort to potentially artificial castling, potential long castling, or potentially even just keeping the king on e1, going h4, rook h3, rook f3, and so on. White has a lot of ideas. We'll have to wait and see what he has in mind. Now here, black continues, knight g to e7. He's officially ready to castle short on the king side, and while e7 is sort of an awkward square for the knight for now, overall, black should be able to untangle, potentially with moves like knight g6, knight e5, and so on. Now here, white has a wide variety of choices, different ways it can proceed. For example, some of the main lines here for white include knight d5, jumping up with the knight, pressuring the queen, bishop e3, opposing the black bishop on the b6 square, and finally, my favorite move on the chessboard from white's perspective, h4, starting the AlphaZero attack, potentially setting up h5 or rook h3 to f3 ideas. Now, in the game, knight d5 was chosen, jumping up with the knight, and of course, pressuring both the queen and the bishop. If you move the queen, let's say, to g6 or wherever else, then of course, white is going to have the simple move, knight takes b6, winning the bishop pair and permanently damaging black's pawn structure after knight takes, then c takes. Therefore, here, knight takes d5 is virtually forced, and that was played in the game. So, knight takes d5, then e takes, and of course, this is a discovered attack on the black king on e8. The queen now is attacking the king on e8. You're also attacking the knight on c6, and therefore the only move that you can play to keep the knight alive and to block the check is the move knight to e7. Of course, if you go, say, knight to d5 here, then the move f4 will hit the pinned knight, and you will win a piece. Therefore, knight e7 here is virtually forced from black's perspective. Now here, in this position, white has a very important decision. How do you want to continue developing? And honestly, it's not so easy to find a good plan. Keep in mind, first of all, black still has pressure on f2. If you move the queen out of the way of f2, say to d3, to open up the development of the bishop, you get checkmated on the spot pretty much. On the other hand, that pawn on d5 is still under attack. And finally, if you move your bishop on c1, then the pawn on b2 will fall to the queen. So overall, it's actually not easy at all to find a good way to continue as white. Now here, the computer finds two good ideas. The first one, and the strongest, is the alpha 0 attack h4, intending potentially rook h3, rook f3, and so on. That is one idea, but Magnus goes for the other idea. He starts a5, the other alpha 0 attack, gaining space on the queen side, driving back that bishop on b6. Again, a very typical idea so far in this game. Black goes bishop a7, retreating back to the very safe a7 square. And here again, h4 is the top engine line according to the computer. However, Magnus Carlsen on move 12, he goes completely off the deep end and he plays the move rook to a4 in the spirit of the Tate opening in the Alekhine's defense, named after Emory Tate. Now, the idea here is very, very simple. You push the pawn to a5 to give the rook access to the a4 square, and then you swing the rook over to f4, hitting the queen with tempo, and somehow the rook has entered the game as a fighting piece. I mean, this has Magnus Carlsen written all over it, if you ask me. All right, here Daniel, he plays classical chess, short castles, getting his king to safety. And Magnus, he does not play classical chess. He goes rook to f4, swinging the rook over. And of course, that rook is being supported by the bishop on the c1 square, and therefore you cannot take it with the queen. With that in mind, where should the queen go? Well, keep in mind here, since black castled, that knight on e7 is only being supported by the queen. Therefore, if you move the queen to, say, g6, you lose the knight on e7 immediately. That would be a massive blunder. Therefore, the only good square that you can go to with the queen is d6. Queen d6 chosen in the game, getting out of the way of the attack of the rook and still maintaining the defense of the knight as the queen is still attacking it. Now here, how should white proceed in this position? Well, the computer really likes the idea of simply c4, gaining space on the queen side. The idea being you do support the pawn on d5, and you also potentially threaten c5 ideas later, as that pawn would be supported by the knight. Overall, c4 would be a very good multi-purpose move. However, instead, in the game, the move h4 was chosen. Now, this move is very thematic for these kinds of Scotch opening positions with the queen on e2. However, if white wanted to go down this route, he should have done it long before going rook a4 to f4, at least according to the engine. Now, the same ideas apply. White may be intending rook h3, maybe rook g3, trying to pressure the king side and so on. And it does have some logic behind it. After all, with the queen blockading that pawn on d7, the bishop, it's going to be a very long time before the bishop can pressure this diagonal, and that means the rook will be relatively safe on the h3 square. However, again, overall, this move a little bit slow in this position. Now here, black, he simply capitalizes on the fact that white did not go c4, defending d5, and of course, he just swoops in and takes that pawn on d5. Knight takes d5, chosen in the game, and now that rook on f4, that once very prestigious, powerful rook, is under attack. Where is he going to go? In the game, rook to e4 chosen, controlling the e-file, but black overall is doing just fine. He retreats the knight, knight to f6. Look at this, that knight going from g8 to e7 to d5, and then finally back to f6, pressuring the rook. And if the rook moves, let's say the rook goes to I don't know, a4, back to the a4 square. Then bang, rook e8 will pin the queen to the king. I mean, it is not easy for white to find a good follow-up here in the game. Magnus, he avoids moving the rook, at least for now, and he finds the intermediate move, bishop f4. Very, very good, very strong, very precise. You simply play the intermediate move, pressuring the queen before doing anything else. Now here, Magnus, Daniel, queen to c6 is the move, moving the queen and increasing the pressure on the rook on e4 even more. Of course, now that rook is going to have to move. In the game, rook c4 chosen, pressuring the queen. Now, of course, black has the option of rook e8, pinning the queen on e2 to the king on e1, but overall, that would be a little bit slow, and of course, white could get a very large edge just with the move rook takes c6. So, instead, queen b5 chosen in the game, getting the queen out of the attack, and now this queen on b5 is going to be very vulnerable along this diagonal. Of course, if the queen and rook move, the bishop on f1 will be targeting that queen. And for that reason, here in this position, instead of queen b5, the stronger move was just queen d5, centralizing the queen, keeping it alive, and keeping it off this diagonal where it could be very vulnerable later in the game. Instead, queen b5 chosen by Daniel. And now here, Magnus, he simply swoops in with the rook. Rook takes c7, winning that free pawn. He now has actually decent fighting chances in this game. Of course, Daniel is still doing a little bit better. However, overall, Magnus is doing okay, and it does look like those queens will be coming off the board very, very soon. Now here, Daniel makes a move that looks very, very obvious at first glance. He plays the move rook to e8, pressuring the queen on e2, pinning it to the king, and so on. However, this move has a very serious tactical flaw, and if white finds it, he will have the advantage immediately. Now, real fast, instead of rook to e8, the strongest move here is simply queen b4 check, hitting the king on e2 immediately, and if you block the check with the move c3, then you lose the knight on b3. For example, queen b4, and if c3, then you just go queen takes b3, and black is completely winning. Now, instead of that, rook to e8 played in the game, and as discussed, this move right here has one simple tactical flaw, and if you like pauses, pause the video right now and try to find this simple tactical problem with this move. It's a very interesting tactical idea, and while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one, guys. All right, here. The key idea, you actually can take the rook on e8. Here's how it works. You go queen takes e8 check. Of course, you can't go queen takes b5 as the queen is pinned to the king on e1. So queen takes b5, not a legal move as your king would be under fire. You can't even make it on this chess.com chessboard. However, you can go queen takes e8. The point being, after knight takes, then you go bishop takes b5, and if knight takes c7, then just bishop e2. And suddenly here in this position, material is even. However, you have the slightly better pawn structure on the queen side. Black has 3 pawn islands versus just 2 for white. And overall, white's pieces are a little bit more active, and that means white would have a small but stable advantage in the endgame. However, Magnus, he did not see all of this. Instead, in the game, in this position, he just goes bishop to e3, and this turns out to be a massive tactical mistake, as you can see by the eval bar completely collapsing on the left side of your screen. And now, according to the engine, white here is actually completely losing already. Now here, the strongest way for black to continue is bishop takes e3, forcing f takes e3, and softening up the king side. Instead, knight d5 chosen in the game, also a very logical move. After all, you are forking the knight on c7 and the bishop on e3. What could be more natural than that? The problem here, though, is white can simply go queen d2, which is a very strong move, and he would be doing relatively okay with the discovered attack of the bishop on the queen on b5. Instead, queen takes b5 chosen in the game by the goat. The goat just cannot resist heading to an endgame, but this endgame is not good for him by any means, and Daniel is going to have excellent winning chances. Now here, of course, black must recapture on b5. He must recapture that queen. A takes b5 chosen in the game. Now we have rook c3, dropping back with the rook, knight takes c3, b takes c3, then bishop takes, f takes, and rook takes e3. And here Daniel, he is literally up the exchange and a pawn in the endgame. Here Daniel has 2 rooks and a minor pieces versus 2 minor pieces and a rook. And he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns versus the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of Magnus. I mean, this is not looking good for the GOAT in the endgame. All right, Magnus, his king is under attack. He goes king d2, returning the favor on the rook on the e3 square. Now we have rook to e5, retreating with the rook. Now rook to h3, activating the rook on the 3rd rank here. Now d6, opening up the discovered attack of the bishop on the rook. Rook to d3, pressuring d6 with the rook. And now rook to a6, defending with the other rook. Now rook d4, bishop e6, c4, trying to open up some lines on the queen side. Of course, that pawn on c4 is defended twice by the bishop and the rook. Therefore, white is not losing material here. And we have b takes c4, bishop takes, and rook to c6. Now, bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and finally, we have an endgame with 2 rooks versus the rook and knight again. Magnus Carlsen, his only chance in this endgame is potentially somehow to try and create a pass pawn, maybe on the queen side, maybe with that pawn on a5, or create some other kind of counterplay, because if he doesn't pull off something crazy, he is going to be dead lost in this endgame. All right, rook b4 is the move, pressuring b7. Now rook d5 hits the king, king to c1. Now rook c7 defends that pawn on b7 with the other rook. Now king b2, e5 is the move, g4 gaining space, rook d1 flying down to the 1st rank. Now we have g5, d5, rook b6, and king to f7. Now h5 gains more space on the king side. Then we have e4, then h6, and e3. Now here, Magnus makes a move that is just completely insane, but I understand the idea behind it. He goes g6, hitting the king. Now we have the infamous pawn square over on the king side, and the idea, at least from Magnus Carlsen's perspective, is that let's say black takes on g6, then you can actually go h7, trying to get a pass pawn. And likewise, if black takes on h6, then g takes h7 also gives you a pawn on h7. So no matter what, white is going to have a pawn on that h7 square sooner or later. Now here in the game, h takes g6 was chosen. Now h7, again, Magnus doing everything he can to get a pass pawn somewhere on the board, the alpha 0 pawn on h7. But here, Daniel, he plays the very simple response, rook to h1, guarding that h7 pawn, guarding the h8 square as well, and that pawn is simply cooked. Now, knight d4 is the move, centralizing the knight, rook to e7, knight f3, and rook takes h7. Now here, Daniel is up the exchange, the rook for the knight, and he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus the 1, 2 of Magnus. Again, things are not looking good for the GOAT. Now, knight g5 hits the king and also hits the rook on h7. Magnus might be fighting back a little bit. Now, king to e8, and here a very interesting move, a6. Magnus, at all costs, trying to fight for a pass pawn. Maybe he hoped his opponent was pre-moving a move. Of course, this was a chess.com blitz game where you can pre-move things, but Daniel, he's right on top of things. B takes a6 chosen in the game. Now, knight takes h7. Here, Magnus is officially up a knight versus the 1, 2, 3, 4 extra pawns. However, the pawn on e3, now the pawn on e2 is simply too strong. And what can Magnus do to stop it? He can't move the rook anywhere to block the e1 square as the king blocks the b1 square. So Magnus here, rook b8 hits the king, king d7, rook b7, then king d6. And here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he simply resigns. There is nothing stopping e1 promoting to a queen. Even if he goes rook b6, the king just goes to c5. And again, the rook has to move. There's no way to defend the e1 square. Black is getting literally a new queen, and that is going to be way too much material even for the GOAT. And for that reason, he simply resigns on the spot to Daniel Naroditsky. Wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Daniel Naroditsky from January 1st, 2025, and especially what an insane rook lift by the GOAT, starting with a5, then rook to a4, and finally rook f4 straight out of the opening. I mean, what a ridiculous strategy. It almost seemed to work in the game, but Daniel was just too good. He shut it down, and he won a very well-deserved game. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of today's game. Did you like it? What do you think of the Rook lift? I personally love this Rook lift in the spirit of the Tate opening in the Alekhine's defense. And real fast, if you don't know the Tate opening, it goes something like this: e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, and then instead of d4, you go c4, knight b6, a4, a5, and then rook to a3, intending something like rook g3. I actually have a video on my channel about the Tate opening. You know what? I'm going to link it right there. If you want to see Emory Tate play the Tate opening, and also Gotham Chess used the Tate opening. Yes, Gotham Chess actually used Emory Tate's new opening in a game once, I believe. I covered it in that video. So if you want to see Emory Tate and Gotham Chess use the Tate opening, very similar to what Magnus Carlsen did today against Daniel Naroditsky, check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.